Right. Great to see you all. As Mike said, we ditched the webinar. The webinar is gone, dead sad. But this was my reasoning behind. So we did like an informal survey of what everyone thought about the webinar. And the big thing that everyone felt like they lost was the communal aspect, so that we're all different parts of the country, but seeing each other on the Zoom, even though a lot of people keep their cameras off, that's totally fine. People said they missed even just seeing the names of the people that they recognized, to know that it wasn't, just some anonymous group of people. So we brought it back, and actually we're going to lean into it a little bit harder. If you see up at the top of the screen, it says live on Facebook. We're offering a even more anonymous version. That's just like if people are just checking out and are not even sure they want to come on, they can actually watch it on our Facebook page. And so then we thought that if people could watch it there, if they come into Dot Church, into the Zoom, then we can try to make it feel more like a communal space. And so we'd actually encourage you guys, if any of you are feeling up for it, to turn your cameras on. But if you're not in a good place for that, no pressure at all. But some of you are. Some of you have turned it off because you felt peer pressure to keep it off. So we're going to say, if you're in that spot where you're like, yeah, I can show my face, then feel free to turn the camera on. We think it'll be more of an engaging, communal experience. So yes, with all that being said, we have spent several weeks talking about heavy stuff, and it's like important work, but it is necessary work, but it can be draining. And so I'm always trying to weigh the balance of how much time that we spend deconstructing what's wrong with the church in America, and how much time we spend rebuilding or reconstructing a truer picture of Jesus and what his church can be. And so tonight we're going to be talking about pastors. We've talked about the problems of celebrity pastors and narcissistic pastors and toxic culture creating pastors. And if all of these are the wrong way to be a pastor, then what is a better way? What's a more Jesus-like way to pastor? I think many of us, we can be drawn to people and pastors who are charismatic speakers and visionary leaders, but then we end up feeling surprised when we don't feel pastored by them. And so as we think about reconstructing and even maybe coming back into some of those church spaces, and I know some of you are very far from feeling comfortable from stepping back into any church, but for some of you who are maybe thinking, you know what, now that things are opening up, I am thinking about going back to church, I think it can be helpful to know what to be looking for in a church pastor. So we need to ask, what should a pastor look like? What should a pastor do? What should a pastor be? And so joining us tonight is Lee Eclov. He retired as a pastor after 40 years of local pastoral ministry, and now he focuses his ministry on other pastors. He's the author of a couple books. The first one is called Feels Like Home: How Rediscovering the Church as Family Changes Everything. And the second one is called Pastoral Graces: Reflections on the Care of Souls. He's also a frequent contributor to Preaching Today and CT Pastors. And he can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm pretty sure CT is Christianity Today, which is a really big magazine and organization. He was also a professor at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School for about 20 years. And he's teaching a summer course at Denver Seminary, which is my alma mater. I actually graduated like a week ago. So that's really exciting. But I actually know Lee on a much more personal level. Growing up, he was Mr. Eclov to me. I was really close with his son, Andy, still am. And Andy's house was the hangout spot for many years in middle school and high school and even some of college. And so I'd come over for a sleepover with Andy and some of our other friends, and I would usually end up talking to Lee for a while about things related to Christianity. And so he's just been this incredible source of wisdom and encouragement for me, particularly for over a decade. So if you would, please give him a really warm Dot Church welcome. And Lee, feel free to unmute yourself and we can just dive right into this conversation.
I'm ready. You've talked about all those other kind of pastors. Tonight you have old bald pastor. There's a lot of us.
I also wanted to say my earliest memory of you was you were driving me home from coming to your house, probably in 5th grade, maybe 6th grade. And you were driving me home and you were asking me for directions. And we pulled into my neighborhood and you said, okay, which way do I go? And I say, you're going to take a left right up here. And you said, left, right, which way? And I thought it was hilarious. I've thought about it to this day. So it left a big impact all the way then. So I just want people to get a sense of the type of person you are, the type of pastor that you are, and then we can kind of talk about your thought process behind things. But you're first and foremost a storyteller, That's one thing that I've loved about your sermons and loved just about talking with you, that you tell a great story, and I think that's woven into everything that you do. So I would love just to open us up with a time when you saw a person's life really be transformed in your church and how you got to be a part of the process. And feel free to sprinkle in any details about the church as you go.
Well, I talked to my wife about it. It was kind of funny. That was a hard question. I mean, most transformation in people's lives is slow. Once in a while, you see some overnight thing, but Jesus told this little tiny parable, it's only in Mark, about how the kingdom of God is like a seed that you plant and then you go to sleep. And then in the morning, it's there. And it's not big stuff. But one of the privileges of a pastor is seeing really amazing things, beautiful things. I was in one church for 14 years, another church for 22 years. And so I watched the children grow up. I watched changes come and go. I was thinking about a guy named Dan who I think first met me at a wedding. And I think I might have done their wedding. This is a long time ago. And he was this tall scientist since early 30s. He was a hard guy. He drank too much. He smoked all the time. He was smart and tough. He was a street fighter scientist. It's kind of a weird mix. But he came to talk to me, and he was certainly a skeptic about Christianity. And then gradually his tone changed so that his problem was he felt he couldn't ever live up to being a Christian. And I remember we met numerous times. I remember meeting with him, and he just reeked of smoke. That's what I remember about him. And he was a really anxious guy. But finally it came to a point where, I just said, nobody's coming to church that can do what we're supposed to do. This is why we need Jesus. And he finally, after lots of times of just visiting and me not pushing, he was ready to put his faith in Christ. And he was such a proud guy, one of the proudest guys I'd ever met, very arrogant. I said, Dan, I don't do this very often, but I want you to remember that you have bowed before Jesus, so we're going to get down on our knees. And we prayed, and he asked Jesus to be a savior. And he didn't transform overnight. He was still tough. He was still arrogant, but he started reading his Bible. He'd wrestle with what it meant to follow Jesus. And then in his, I think he was 36 or 38, he just dropped dead of a heart attack. He had lived so hard, drugs and all the drinking, all that stuff, that his body just gave out. But it was a privilege really to do his funeral and to talk about the change in his life. There's been so many of those things, not all that dramatic, just watching people over the years. Yeah, it's a great privilege.
I love that it's a slow change, because I think a lot of times when we hear people talk about their testimonies, people will talk about the most dramatic part. And a lot of times we have people tell their stories if they have a really dramatic story of,
right.
I was doing this crazy thing and then the next day it all stopped. But I think in the majority of cases, people's transformation is very slow.
Yeah. And you mentioned in your introduction tonight how some of the folks tuning in here are in places of doubt or whatever. Well, that's fine. I mean, that's part of the journey. And Jesus doesn't ask us to surrender our minds in order to become a follower. It's not like that. And for some people, it's really clear. It's really simple. It's childlike. For some, it isn't.
Definitely. Tell me about a time where you faced or someone from your church faced something like incredibly difficult, some type of, big challenge, and that you were there with them, like as the pastor, every step of the way.
Well, one way pastors do that, I mean, there's things that are always flowing in and out of a church. Sometimes people know about it, sometimes they don't. People tell a pastor things they've never told anyone. I remember a guy that I sat with. I was new in the church. I was just trying to get acquainted. And this guy came to meet me and we were just chatting. And in the course of things, he tells me something. He says, I've never told anybody this. He says, when I was 12, I was out with a buddy. We were hunting. And I don't know if they stumbled or what, but he shot the other guy by accident. And his friend was paralyzed for the rest of his life. And
Wow.
this fella had this on his back and he started crying. And, you know, and then he was just in the church and we just, I don't know if anything changed. I don't know if he was better. I don't know. Things are slow. Watch folks going through divorce that can be really messy, wayward children that really break their hearts, illnesses, death of a parent. I mean, there's so many things, loss of jobs. You know, it's so weird in 2008 when the markets crashed. The young people in our church hardly knew that was a thing. They almost weren't aware of it because they didn't have any money in the markets.
Yeah.
And the old people in the church were shell shocked. I had a woman who'd lost, I think it was 60% of her money
Wow.
to live on. Well, we walked through that. I was thinking about one story that came to my mind was a guy that was in our church in Pennsylvania named Larry. He was a young dad and he got cancer. And, you know, it was a slow thing and we walked with him. I'd go to visit him and I'll never forget the last time I went to see him. It was May 2nd, 1990. He would die. His funeral would be 1 month later. He was very ill. He was bedbound. And he wanted to talk about his funeral. He told me, he started talking about death and what he thought about. And he'd kind of gotten past the grief. And he said that. He says, I've grieved for my children, for my wife, but now I'm not there anymore. And he said, he talked to me about his funeral. I started writing. I grabbed a piece of paper. I'm writing up and down the margins because there was stuff on it, he was saying such profound stuff. And I remember him saying, at my funeral, I don't want it to be all sadness. I want it to be joy. He says, finally, it's my turn. He says, at my funeral, I just want this. And he did this big clap. Pretty amazing to sit in a room like that.
So the picture that you're describing, right? Being with people on their deathbeds, being with people at their lowest points, I think that can be a pretty big difference from the pastor picture that we might have in our mind, where it's a visionary CEO type leading who might say, I don't have time for hospital visits. I don't have time to be, you know, that's why we have other staff and we have counselors that we send people to. In your picture of what a pastor is, what's the difference? Because I don't think in any of our conversations we've had for years now, I've never seen you think about the role of a pastor in like those kind of corporate ways. So from your perspective, what is a pastor? What should they be doing? What should they be spending their time doing? How have you thought that through as you've pastored for 40 years?
Well, to be fair, sometimes God himself grows a church big and somebody's got to be the shepherd of that flock. And you can't do it on a small scale. I mean, you've got to manage staff and be aware you're preaching to a large audience and there's all kinds of things that go with that that's hard and different. Most of us as pastors don't do that. I pastored, the biggest church I pastored when I left was about 650. And that was about the limit of my ability to know people. I'd passed the mark where I could remember the children's names. So generally they were Buddy and Honey because I couldn't remember all their names. And, but a pastor means shepherd. I'm the shepherd of a flock. I read a wonderful article about a shepherd in Jordan who had big flocks. And he didn't have them all named, but he knew all his sheep. And he said, the guy asked him, have you ever lost one? He says, oh yeah, we've lost them, but there's only think he said there's only one we never could account for, and I think of it every day.
Wow.
As a pastor, you're caught because you do well. Let me back up. A shepherd's job is what? To feed, to lead, and to guard a flock. That's your job. Feed, lead, and guard. And leading primarily, if you look at the 23rd Psalm, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not. He leads me on paths of righteousness. So the job of a pastor is to lead a flock to walk on paths of righteousness, personally and corporately, that we are becoming like Jesus. Now that works out on very pragmatic, practical terms, like how worship service works or what your giving is or all kinds of stuff. But those are the fundamental jobs. Feeding is the word of God. That's how you feed people. Guarding is that there's dangers to Christians from heresy, from sin, from disunity, dissension, all these things. And pastors are kind of always supposed to be sort of on guard for this stuff and drive away the predators, the wolves, right? So those are our jobs. And I think it's hard for a real shepherd to be the pastor of a big church. It's very dividing. Stuff that's near to your heart, you can't do. You just don't have the bandwidth to take care of and to know all these people. But in the ways of God, for me, my churches have not been that big. And I had the space to know virtually every name, usually by the second week. I mean, we worked at names. We worked at knowing people's names. You don't really love somebody till you know their name. And I would work at that. I'd work with the others in the office. Did anybody meet that guy that was sitting, by the Smiths in the second row, like that? So personal touch. Not everybody needs care all the time, but you do have to be sensitive to these things. So those, some thoughts.
No, I think that's so good, so helpful. You brought up a lot of the challenges, and we're seeing pastors leave pastoring behind in record numbers.
Correct.
What, from your perspective, is accounting for that? What are the unique challenges maybe of pastoring in 2021 that would make people step away? Because I know that you counsel lots of pastors, and so I think my guess is the ones that you talk to, a lot of them are probably on the verge of saying, "I'm done. I'm hanging it up."
I was just with a pastor today, a wonderful pastor, who walked away because of family pressures, that he felt compromised his home. In 2019, before COVID, I read statistics that said 90% of people who were pastors at some point in their life would not retire as pastors. I mean, I retired as a pastor. There are not that many in my class that did so. And it's not always for bad reasons, but it is a tough work. It is a very tough work. And it has become much worse in the last year or so. Pastors have been thrust into duties and ways of trying to care for a flock that were not at all satisfying. I mean, to have to figure out live streaming and Zoom stuff and how to do ministry over the phone or whatever, there's no real fulfillment in that. It's not like starting a new sermon series. It's just draining. And on top of that was the tremendous pressure on pastors over political stuff. And it was almost like it all came down to the pinpoint of those stupid masks and how people fought over those masks. It's my right. I can't make me do this. I'm not coming to church if we don't wear them. And pastors were caught in the middle of this stuff. The battling over politics, which was a no-win situation, because you thought your people loved each other. And then you find out when push comes to shove, and they did come to shove, they really had other things that took precedence over Jesus' top command, which is love one another. And pastors got stuck in the middle of this, and they want out. It's so hard. I have to say, I've just been writing a piece or two about this. There is another side that I think as pastors in training, we don't go into the training for ministry like soldiers would. Soldiers go into training expecting the battle.
Hmm.
And if they get through their career without the battle, great, but they go expecting the battle. Pastors are not trained to expect the battle.
Hmm.
We're trained to preach the sermon, to grow the church, do all these things. So when the battle comes, we're kind of caught off guard by how hard it is. It is terribly, it's emotionally hard. Even in good days, the burdens of your people, just the things that people are carrying. If you love your people, it's hard. Even if everybody loves you, it's hard. So, and the spiritual weight of responsibility. I am responsible before God for these people. Where was Tom the last month? What
Yeah.
happened to the Smiths? I haven't seen them for a while. I heard that so and so their marriage is in trouble. You think about this stuff. I had an elder once. I kind of went through a meeting. One meeting I read. I had about a page and a half of names from our church, which was we didn't even have. We had maybe roughly 200 people coming. I just read names, and one of the elders said, "You can't really worry about all these people." I go, "I'm not worried about them, but they're all my flock, and I know these things, and I care about them." That's the role of a pastor.
Yeah, yeah, and that's very different. And I think maybe it even goes to the seminary level, like you're saying, like what they teach in seminary, and just the pictures of popular pastors that we see, to be thinking about, I'm going to spend my nights and weekends thinking about those 30 or 40 people. I'm not sure, at least from the people that I've seen, not everyone going into seminary who loves talking about theology and loves preaching is also thinking, I can't wait to be thinking about those people in their lives. And,
Right.
for whatever
Right.
reason, it might attract slightly different minded people, maybe more intellectually minded, more charismatic public speakers. And so I think reframing that picture of a pastor is going to be the great big task of the next, 20, 30 years in seminaries, especially as church looks so different. Smaller churches are becoming more of the norm.
Right.
There's some very large churches, obviously, but a lot of them have shrunk, and we're seeing a lot more popping up all over that are maybe 50 people with maybe a bivocational pastor or one paid part-time or something like that.
That's right. I just want to say, Anthony, is as these guys were all popping up here on my screen, and I
Yeah.
know almost no one here. And as you introduced what was going on, and that some of you guys are disconnected or whatever from the church, the verse that I felt God just brought to my mind, I wasn't expecting this, was there's this wonderful verse where it says, when Jesus saw the crowds, and I was looking at you,
Mm-hmm.
he had compassion on them because they were harassed and helpless like sheep without a shepherd.
Hmm.
And we had about 10 young adults from our church. We're new. We moved to Rockford, Illinois here a little over just before COVID. We're going to a church. We're not the pastor anymore. I'm just going, but we just decided to invite young adults over to our house last Sunday night. We had about 10 that looked like you guys. They didn't know each other because this is a merged church as of 6 months ago. So these folks don't know each other. And it was just so fun to be with them and to hear what the books they were reading and the games they were working on and the profession. And I just thought, Jesus loves these. My heart goes out to you guys. I kind of wish I could just sit with you because some of you just need a pastor right now.
Yeah. Yeah. We got some good questions and comments in the chat. Mike Spangler, he said, I think another reason for pastors leaving is the lack of pay and salary that many of them receive. Many times they can be scolded for asking for more money because of a perceived lack of faith. Mike, I think that could definitely be true. And then a question came through. Did you ever go through seasons of significant doubt about the Bible or God or Jesus? If so, did you have to keep it on the down low because of your role as a pastor?
I didn't doubt those things. I remember two specific times where the burdens of people kept coming and we were praying and nothing seemed to be happening. And I felt like I wouldn't say I had to be God's cheerleader, but I had to represent God to these people. And I remember praying, God, you got to show me something that just bolsters my own faith, because I'm having trouble helping them. And he did. I don't remember what it was. I don't know that it was some big thing. It was just, okay, all right, I got my wind. I don't think it was doubt about these cardinal things for me. I'm probably just not wired that way. I don't know if it was what it was. I just didn't. I did wonder about being a pastor. And I went through a couple, maybe 3 pretty serious times of depression that were just really hard. And so I didn't hide those things from church leaders, and I didn't feel oppression. It's just really hard to be anything if you're depressed. It was really hard to be a pastor when you're depressed. So that's what I faced.
Yeah. So we try to say on Dot Church in a lot of the conversations, like, because it can very much be mega churches are evil, small churches are good. And that's an unfair, not true paradigm. There's small churches that are really messed up. There's big churches that are really messed up. And then there's very, very God-honoring small churches, very God-honoring large churches. But maybe speak to a little bit of that dynamic just as churches get bigger. Is it just inevitable that the pastor becomes less available and less there for the congregation? Like, can pastors of these growing churches, can they do anything to stay more grounded with their people and connected with the church?
Yes and no. There are ways, at least that I found, that seemed enough for people, even though I wasn't, hugely involved. I loved next to preaching, which is my favorite job. I loved walking around the auditorium and the foyer. I just couldn't get enough of it. I kept moving, and I tried not to get tied up with my friends or somebody that wanted to ask me about church work or something. I love that. And I think it communicated to everybody watching that Pastor Lee is personal. I could talk to him. I think I would try to be aware of what I would just call sort of God's nudge or an impulse. Check on so-and-so. If Anthony came to mind a couple of times in a week, I'd just shoot Anthony an email, say, you were on my mind. How you doing? Or the next Sunday, I'd walk by him and I go, hey, I've been thinking about you. Are you okay? Or what's happening in your life? It reminds me of, as a singer, I was a singer, and in groups, when we were in a small group singing, we were taught, just like in a speech class, fix your eyes on one person for a moment rather than always panning. And somehow in the psychology of a group, when I look at one person, you think that's good. You see that's personal. I think that's kind of true in church life too. And I think if I have a rule in my life, the next person up is the important person. The next person that calls me, the next person in the foyer, child, old, influential, guest, doesn't matter. The next person up is going to have all my attention for a few moments, then I keep moving. I just think things like that help. But I also understand that as a church gets bigger, it's just really hard for a pastor to just kind of know where to look. And remember too, here's another interesting, many pastors are introverts. And so the crowd is draining for them. They'll do it, but it's really draining. I'm an extrovert. I can make friends in a coffee shop. It's just different for me. So I get credit sometimes for being a wonderful pastor when it's just my personality.
Speak a little to the small group leaders. So we have a lot of small groups as a part of Dot Church, and in many ways, they're kind of the shepherd of that group. What
Right.
like encouragement would you give them? How would you challenge them maybe?
But one, pray for your people. And when you pray for them, one, you may know stuff, just what do you think they need prayer for? I mean, it might be something they told you, but maybe not. It's also just when you're praying, just be quiet and think about Mary and see if God just kind of prompts you to think about something. I mean, where does that go? Then you can kind of speak to that. You know, Mary, I was thinking about you when I was praying for you, and I just wondered, have you been lonely lately? You live alone, it's been tough, or whatever. I think another is to be inquisitive about people's souls. So here's Tom that's out of work. You got any leads for jobs? That's one question. But Tom, how has this been for you with God, being without work these weeks? What's that like for you? And just listen. But ask kind of spiritually nosy questions. I mean, really, at least as a pastor, I discovered people gave me permission to do that. I could just ask things. I'd stand in a hospital room, and instead of worrying about, do I dare? I'd say, is death on your mind here? What are you thinking about? And just ask. People welcomed it. And I'd say one other thing is, remember, the way that you feed people is the Bible. It's not just sympathy. It's not just, it's not your advice, for crying out loud. It's Bible. And if you don't know something from the Bible, if nothing comes to mind, say, I'm going to pray about this and think about this. It's not like you have a verse for everything. It's not, I don't mean that. It's just that you are kind of shaped by reading the Bible.
My brother Vince and I, we used to give each other feedback on our sermons because he's a pastor, down in Kentucky. And so we would always give feedback. And so sometimes I would show him a sermon that I'd be working on, and he would say, "This sounds interesting, but this isn't really what the passage is saying."
Right.
He'd be like, "That's clever and interesting, but it's not really what the text is saying." And every time that he would, encourage me to actually get closer to what the real meaning would be to the people who were originally hearing it and applying that in our lives today, the sermon was always infinitely more impactful, because it's not Anthony's wisdom. It's this ancient tradition, right? It's this word of God being lived out.
That's right. We are preachers and Bible teachers, or even just a friend representing God, but especially a pastor. I am like a press secretary. The press secretary comes out and represents the president, and they say more than the president says, but they better not say anything the president doesn't want said. They're expanding on what the president has in mind. That's what I do with the scriptures. I take the Bible, I study it, I help people understand it, I apply it in different ways, help them see how this works out, but I better not go beyond what that author, inspired by God, wanted to say, or you're right, I'm off the reservation.
Off the reservation, yeah. And the chances that you're going to come up with something that's going to have more of an impact or last, over 2,000 years, you're probably pretty low.
Right.
Your words are probably not going to stand the same test of time as these words that are 3,000 years old, 2,000 years old.
Yep.
We got a good question. What's your best advice to young people who want to be in full-time ministry? And because we've got a lot of seminary students who come to our church, so what would you tell them, knowing what you know at the stage of your life?
Well, that's a great question. I would say part of seminary, paradoxically, is it can drain your vitality with Jesus. It's almost like an overabundance of input. And it's not the seminary's fault. It's nobody's fault. It's just what happens. I'd say, if you don't pray very well in seminary, you won't pray very well when you're a pastor, unless you're scared. you pray well when you're scared. And I was scared a fair amount of time as a pastor. That does help you pray. I would say wherever you are, be all, like a church, wherever you, or whatever your ministry is, be all there and do it as well as you can in the small jobs. The person who's faithful in little will be made ruler over much. So be faithful in the little things. I remember a seminary guy who was in our church. He was so gifted. He was particularly gifted in Hebrew, and he was teaching. Here he was in seminary. He was teaching an Old Testament class down at Moody Bible Institute, which is a pretty big deal. And in our church, his job was to teach with his wife Sunday school, and they had 2 kids. And they knew a lot. They were from a Christian home. They knew their Bibles back and forth. But Doug was asked to preach in a church. He wanted to preach, as a guest. He turned him down. He says, I don't want to be away from those 2 kids. And he started crying when he told me this.
Wow.
Be faithful in the little thing. I'd say another thing is find a guy like me to talk to. I mean, if it's the pastor in your church or somebody, but find somebody just to talk to and learn from and be teachable. It's not all about the mechanics. Just find somebody to be a pastor, mentor, model. I love doing that. I miss that, having students. So I don't know. I could do more if I had more time to think about it, I suppose, but that's a really good question. I have such a heart for ministry students, but you got to love the church for all its freckles and bruises and nasty stuff. You got to love it.
I had 2 last questions that I think we could combine into one.
Okay.
So I think we've talked a little bit about this, and my brother and I, Dominic, who's on this call, we were both there for your last Sunday at your church in Lincolnshire. And so as you were telling this final story, and I would love if you would just share that. And in the story, at least when you told it on that Sunday, you talked a little bit about feeling kind of that desire to have the big church, to have reached all these people. So maybe speak a little bit to, has that been a struggle for you to say, I'm not the guy with the 5,000 person church?
Right.
And what does that do internally to your heart and your soul as you're thinking through that? And then maybe just tell that story for the people here, because I thought it was amazing and moving, and I would love for people to hear it.
The mark of success for pastors in our heads is a bigger church, right? I mean, if a business is, the measure of a business is that it grows. The mark of a team is that it wins. I mean, so the mark of a church, successful church, and a successful pastor is that the church gets bigger. Well, that's true. And metrics, which is the measure of churches too often, is nowhere in the Bible. We know nothing about the size of the church in Ephesus. We know about the day that the church started, how many people were converted. And we know at the very end that there will be countless people around the throne of God. And in the middle, we don't know anything. But that pressure for pastors, way more than for the people, is just relentless. And it's such a mark of success for us. Well, I lived with that. And I moved to Lincolnshire, there in the suburbs, people everywhere, Willow Creek in the shadows, Harvest Bible Chapel in the looming over me. I mean, your church was big in our neighborhood. All these churches around me, I go, churches here grow, and I'm the guy. I'm a good preacher. I'm a good guy. It's going to grow. And it didn't grow. And it was hard. And I got depressed and I doubted myself. Gradually, I came to realize, with the help of wise elders, God is in our church the way it is. And there are things we can do and be that we couldn't be if we were bigger. And I couldn't be the pastor I am. I couldn't get this. I couldn't have the influence in a big church. You think influence is when you get up and speak to 1,000 people or 5,000 people. There's a sense in which I had more influence in a small church where I knew everybody's name. They all knew me. I mean, I did their weddings. I dedicated their children. I did their funerals. I sat with them. I went to their dinners. And they will never forget Pastor Lee. And it's not that way. That's something a big church pastor can't have, even if he's a wonderful pastor. He gives that up. Well, in our church in Lincolnshire, we had a lot of turnover because of students, the nature of the community with business people moving in and out, retirees, stuff like people moving further out to cheaper homes or wherever they went, So there was always turnover. Sometimes our church, some years we lost and gained 20% of our congregation. Well, that's a lot of people. So it had a sense of vitality because it was growing, but we were always saying goodbye. And that takes a toll on the church, man. It takes a toll on the relationships to always be saying goodbye. And I realized pretty early on as a pastor, I got to put a good face on this, or it's gonna people have to see this like God wants us to see it. So I started using the expression, we put our fingerprints on people. And then they go on, but they come to our church, and our privilege is to give them this experience of a great, loving church. And we're going to do the best we can that way and love on these people. And if they leave, at least they can say, we were in such a great church. God worked in my life in that place. We're going to put our fingerprints on. Well, as I approached my ending, I retired on my 22nd anniversary in that church. And about 2 or 3 months before that, one of the guys came to me one day and he says, don't ask any questions, but I want your fingerprints. And well, I didn't ask any questions. And I gave him my fingerprints, Well, at our farewell, at the very end, after all these wonderful things people did, they brought out this big picture. Maybe you can show them this picture.
Yeah, I got it right here.
There, you see that? And that is my thumbprint. And when you look close at it, when you get up close, there are 1,000 names of everybody who came through our church in 22 years.
It's just amazing.
It is a precious, hangs in our hallway here. It is a very precious thing. I show every pastor who comes to visit with me, I show them that picture, because we forget when you don't get to preach to a whole gang of people. This matters. And I am so thankful I got to be a pastor. It's a great privilege. Yeah, it's a great privilege to talk to you guys. I wish I could know you better.
And Lee, you said, I think on that Sunday you said, I always wanted to reach a lot of people, and then you said like it was something along the lines. You're like, I looked back and I realized that I did. It just wasn't all at once. It was something like that, which was I thought was amazing, which is so true.
It was. That's right. It was just, I thought they were all going to come at once. I thought they'd all be sitting in the pews at the same time, but they weren't. And it was better this way, for me at least.
Yeah.
Better for my own heart. It was better for me as a shepherd. It was better for our church. In a smaller church, you got to love each other. You can't just hide. You can't just slip in and slip out and be in the, it's not always the pastor's fault. There's a lot of people who just don't want to be engaged. And Jesus' number one command is you got to love one another. He also said, love your neighbor, but your neighbor and the one another aren't the same. The one another is the other disciples in the room. And they're the tough ones. Because you got to get up close and personal, and you got to stick with them. You can't just dodge the bullet. It's hard. Nobody knows that better than pastors.
Yeah. Well, Lee, thank you so much. This has been such a blessing. It's been such a blessing for me. And I guarantee it's been a blessing for so many people on the call. What's the place for people to find out more about you? Maybe check out your books or.
Well, I have a website. It's kind of aimed at pastors, but it has a lot of the stuff I've written, and it's just my name. You can see my name on the screen there, leeeclov.com.
I just dropped it in the chat too for anyone. Yeah. I would definitely recommend checking it out.
Nobody in the world has my name except me. So it's pretty easy. And there's stuff I've written there, names of the books, but also I've written lots of articles and stuff. And if you want to write to me, you can. It tells you there how to send me a message. I'm happy to right back. And I'm retired. I'll take time. So,
Definitely. Well, everyone, give Lee a big thank you in the chat.